Hey, my name is Brendan. This is another video in my series on sound design and synthesis, where we'll be learning how to turn the sounds in your head into synthesizers you can use in your projects. As always, we'll be using the free cross-platform software Helm, which I've put a link to in the description of this video if you haven't downloaded it yet. Now, in our last video, we learned how to turn some of the basic principles of synthesis, like using waveform oscillators and the amplitude envelope, and even a bit of modulation. We used all of that knowledge to make a chiptune lead sound. And today, we're going to build on some of the principles we already know and figure out how to make a pluck sound, which is one of the core sounds that you'll be coming back to again and again in your synthesis. It's great for arpeggios, and it's also great with a bit of tweaking to turn into a bass, which we'll get into more next video. But for today, let's get started by finding the oscillators that we want to use today. Now I'm going to go over to the oscillator section over here, and I think I'd like a square wave as my main oscillator, and I might mix in sort of a noisier oscillator, like one of these stepped oscillators that tend to have quite a bit of artifacts. But a lot of that will get filtered out, so there will be just sort of that biting noise that we'll hear for a second before the filter kicks in, which is what I want today. So I'm going to have that at sort of a lowish volume, and my square wave at a bit of a higher volume. Let's hear how that sounds. And lastly, I'll mix in a bit of a sub. I think I'm going to go with a triangle wave, so it's sort of a pure tone in the bottom. Sounds pretty good to me as a starting point. And before I move on to the amplitude envelope, I think I'd like to thicken up the square wave sound using a function in Helm that we haven't really explored yet, which is the detune option. Now this is something that you'll find in virtually any synthesizer, both software and analog, and it's really great for building up your sound from a simple waveform to a more complex set of waveforms. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the square wave that we have and make a couple copies of it that are each pitched a little bit lower and a little bit higher. So what we'll end up getting is a fairly complex sort of intermixing of this sort of chorusing effect of these different slightly detuned oscillators. And I'm going to start by picking 3 voices. I'm going to go under my square wave here, and I'm going to just drag this to the right until it says 3V, 3 voices. And underneath, it's going to determine what the difference is between the lowest and the highest of these detuned voices. Let's increase that slightly to about 20 cents. And I'm just going to click this and we can hear how it sounds. So let's hear how it sounds with just the one voice again. And with the 3 voices. And something worth noting is if you look at our oscilloscope up in the top of Helm, you'll see that there's actually a bit of movement going on within the waveform. That's what we would call a phase, and it's something that happens when you get a couple copies that are very close to each other in tuning, but a little bit off. It makes the waveform shift around a little bit, which creates a bit of movement within the waveform itself, which creates quite a bit of excitement, which I find to be pretty useful for a lot of different synths. Let's look at it one more time. And the higher that we make our this cent number here, the larger difference between the higher and lower versions of the same sound, the faster we'll get some movement there. But this 73 cents is a bit too severe for the sound I want here. I'm going to knock it back down to about 20. And I'm also going to make use of a special function in Helm, which I really love, which is the H harmonizer button. Let's click on that. And what that's going to do is instead of making copies of this square wave at the same pitch as the fundamental that we're hitting, it's actually making them in a harmonic that is above it. And in this case, I think it's making it a fifth above our fundamental note. And all that really means is that it's going to take our square wave from a fairly simple waveform to a slightly more complex one with a bit more harmonic richness. Let's hear how it sounds. Now with one note, we're getting almost a small little chord out of this, which I find really useful. And if we went up further to 5 voices, we'd even get a major triad on top. I think that's not quite the sound I want for today, so I'm just going to go to the 3 voices. With that, I feel like I'm pretty happy with our starting sound. I'm ready to start modulating our amplitude envelope. So, like I said before, we're going to make a pluck today. And if you might remember from our previous video talking about amplitude envelopes, a pluck is an amplitude that has a pretty fast attack and a pretty fast decay and release. And it's going to look a little bit something like this. We're going to move our sustain and decay down and drag our release out just a little bit. And right off the bat, we'll hear how that sounds. So it's got a pretty immediate attack and a slight trail to it, which I think for now I'm going to leave it as it is. I might fine-tune a little bit later, see how it sounds, but I'll leave it like that for now. And while I'm thinking of it, I'm also going to turn our voices down to just 1. That way, if there are some tails ringing out from the release, they're not going to overlap each other. When I press the new key, it's just going to start a new envelope again and take out the one that was previously playing. Let's hear how it sounds. Just sounds a little bit cleaner if we're going to use this as an arpeggio. I think that sounds a little bit nicer to me. So now we're just sort of using techniques we've already learned. I'd like to expand it a little bit by making use of our filter, which is one of the building blocks that we have not yet talked about in synthesis. And as a slight digression, it's worth mentioning that we're going to be using something called subtractive synthesis here, which is where we start with a pretty rich sound with a lot of harmonic content both in the low end and the high end, and we're going to just carve out exactly what we want our sound to be. So if I turn the filter on, right now we have it set up so that it's going to remove everything that's above this point in the frequency range. So if we have it all the way up, it's not going to remove very much at all. And as we move this down, you'll hear as it starts to filter out some of those high frequencies. And get a bit bassier. And if we want, we can also add a peak to this so that right at the edge here, where it's starting to filter things out, it's going to accentuate those frequencies and get a bit of a resonance to it, which is really useful, especially if we add some movement to this. It adds quite a bit of character to the sound. Let's hear how it sounds right now. As you can imagine, this is going to be really handy when we go and make our bass in the next video. And it's worth mentioning that not only can you do this type of filtering, which I think is a high-pass filter, you can also take this knob on the top to make it into a band-pass filter. So it filters both on the high end and the low end. Or you can make it a low-pass filter. So it filters out the bottom end. But for today, I want to do a high-pass filter, where we're filtering out everything that is above a certain threshold. And we could make use of this filter envelope here, which, like our amplitude envelope, is going to be controlling a particular parameter, in this case, the frequency of the filter. But I would actually like to map this movement to our amplitude, so that when our synthesizer is at its highest volume, we're also at the highest frequency. And then when it dips down to a lower volume, it also dips down to a lower, bassier frequency. And I'm just going to show you what that sounds like, and you can get a sense of what this might be useful for. And you'll probably recognize this type of sound from lots of different types of tracks. This is a pretty common technique. So I've clicked on this little helmet by the amplitude envelope, and then I've dragged under here where the frequency is. I've set the range that I want it to be affecting it by. And let's go ahead and save that and just hear what it sounds like. Already you can hear how this is turning into a pretty recognizable sound that you would have heard on all sorts of dance tracks, electronic tracks, really all over the place. This is a pretty common technique, and it's one that's so common that in Helm, they've actually introduced a little knob to help make it a little bit easier if you're using the filter envelope instead of the amplitude envelope. You can just set the envelope depth, and we'll explore this a little bit more in our bass lesson next video. But for today, let's just understand that we are using the amplitude to modulate the frequency of the filter, and that's creating this pretty quickly moving resonant peak here. And I think we're getting close to the end of this particular sound. It's got a nice sort of bite to it. But I want to make a little bit of movement and a little bit of randomness in this sound. And I'm going to do that by using our velocity mod over here. This way, when I'm playing let's say live, or when I'm recording, using the keyboard rather than writing in the MIDI notes, I can sort of set some parameters of this synth as I'm playing and add a little bit of liveliness to it. And the first thing I want to change, I think, is I want to make it so that when I hit the note pretty hard on my keyboard, when there's a high velocity, I think I want the note to play for longer. So I might actually set the initial release pretty short. And I want to make it so that when I hit it hard, the release gets greater and longer, and maybe the sustain as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right over to my velocity on my keyboard mod section in the bottom left-hand corner. And I'm going to go ahead and drag this release up. Let's do a pretty extreme example to start just so we can hear it, and then we'll dial it back as we listen to that sound. And I'll do the same thing with the sustain. So right now, when I hit the keyboard hard, both the sustain and the release of our envelope are going to increase. And let's hear what that sounds like. I'm going to start with some sort of soft notes. Pretty quiet, or rather pretty short. And let's hear with some higher velocity notes. So now my goal is that when I hit these notes a little bit harder, they'll ring out and they really poke through the mix. And another thing that I can use to accentuate this sort of effect is to increase my velocity tracking at the bottom here. What that basically means is that the harder that I hit the note, the louder the synth is going to be overall. And I'll set that to about 70%. So that, we'll still hear it if it's quiet, but it's going to have a noticeable effect in the volume when I hit with a higher velocity. It's going to sound like this. Nice. That's getting a little bit closer to the sound I want. And I think I'd also like to open up the filter that we have here when I'm hitting with a higher velocity. So I'm going to map this velocity on the keyboard mod to the filter envelope. And before I do that, it's worth mentioning here that, yes, I actually do have two different modulators affecting this same exact parameter. We have the amplitude affecting it, and we also have the velocity affecting it at the same time. And those are going to compound on top of each other. The amplitude is going to happen no matter how hard I'm hitting the velocity. And then the velocity is just going to add on top of that. The end result being pretty much that when I hit the velocity really hard, that the envelope is going to go quite high because the velocity is going to add on top of the amplitude envelope. Let's hear what it sounds like. Let's do a fairly noticeable amount. And again, we can dial it back later if we need to. In general, I think it's good to start with a pretty big effect and dial it back to taste rather than starting small, because you can get a sense of whether the general principle is going to work or not. So let's hear what it sounds like. Here's quiet. And hear is pretty loud. Nice. I think that is getting closer to doing what I want. I just want to add a couple little finishing touches. One of which I add to very many things, is I'm going to sort of use the same trick that we did in our last video where we used the chiptune lead. I'm going to set a bit of a vibrato on the main oscillator. And instead of having the strength of the vibrato set by the mod wheel, I'm going to have that set by the velocity too. And I don't want this to be an extreme effect, just enough that it's noticeable. So I'm going to set that to about mid-strength, and we'll hear what that sounds like. Maybe a little bit higher. Maybe I'll slightly increase the amount that it's modulating the tune. It's a little subtle, but I think it sounds pretty good. And lastly, let's add a little bit of reverb. Maybe we can even do the same thing. I mean, let's sort of go all out here, and let's map the velocity to the mix of the reverb. And let's do it sort of inverse to the damping. And maybe we'll do a similar thing with the delay, where we'll set the mix to be higher with higher velocity. Let's do 16th note. I'll set that a little bit lower. This is sounding pretty close to done to me. I mean, there's a lot of fine-tuning and modulation that I could add on to this. And I think it's worth noting that even though we started with a pretty basic starting point of just a couple waves and a basic envelope, what really made this sound unique was all the modulation that we added, and how responsive we made it by adding all of this velocity modulation on. I have really recently been loving adding some velocity mods onto all sorts of parameters in Helm. And there's a couple different keyboard mods that you can add as well. Like you can add a note one, so that, say for example, if you play a low note, it's going to be a low response to the modulation. And if you play a higher note, it's going to be a higher response. There's actually a built-in function for that in Helm with this key track, where the envelope is going to stay a little bit, or the filter rather, is going to stay a little bit lower if you're playing a lower note, but it'll open up if you're playing a higher note. And let's set that to a middle value and see what that sounds like. You can hear there's a lot of high end still coming in when we're playing a higher note because we have key tracking on. And I could sort of get into all of these different modulation techniques forever and ever in this, but I think I'm going to leave this video here for now. And in the next one, we'll sort of build on some of the techniques we learned here and work on making a bass for some of our tracks. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you take what we learned today and build your own cool synths. Till next time, see ya.